Hi guys, let's talk about Paley and Shi's rule. Okay, so at a certain point in the three-body problem, after Wang Miao sees the universe flicker, he is kind of a mess. He's very distraught. He doesn't know what's going on. There are all of these sort of fundamental theoretical questions which are raised for him and which are kind of overwhelming for him. And Dashi, the detective, who's sort of hard-nosed and focused on the case, picks him up and tries to get his head right. And in the course of the conversation that they have, Dashi explains what he calls, or what we might call, Shi's rule, which he says, anything sufficiently weird must be fishy, which he explains a little bit later on means that if you can't explain something, that probably means that there's somebody behind it. It's somebody is brought this state of affairs about intentionally. And there are a lot of questions we could ask about Shi's rule. One question we could ask is about what sort of role Shi's rule plays in kind of his whole way of thinking, right? Shi represents in the story a way of life and a way of thinking about things where you kind of try to ignore theoretical and philosophical questions as they come up, and you try to just sort of focus on the problems that you encounter in everyday life. And there are some advantages to this way of life, and there are some disadvantages to this way of life. And we can ask about sort of how Shi's rule advances or functions in that sort of way of getting along and way of thinking about things. But I'm going to set that set of questions to the side. Instead, I want to look at when Shi's rule works, or in what sense Shi's rule is true. So the argument in the first couple of chapters of Paley's Natural Theology is an interesting sort of test case for Shi's rule, and I think can help give us some interesting traction on this question, this tricky question of under what conditions is it reasonable when observing a seemingly natural phenomenon to infer that somebody is behind it, that it is the work of a designer or an agent. Okay, so Paley offers a famous argument for the existence of God, and this argument proceeds through an analogy to watches. So he says, if you encountered a watch on the beach, you didn't see how it got there, maybe you've never seen this particular type of watch before, you would still infer that this was designed. This isn't just like a rock or a grain of sand. Somebody at some point must have put this watch together, and that's why it's there. Well, why would you infer that? This is a really interesting question. What is it about watches that leads us to infer that they must have been designed, where with rocks and sand we don't make that same inference? Well, he says, the main thing to know is that watches are complex and they have a bunch of different parts which, to all appearances, work together to perform a common function, namely moving the dials of the watch at regular intervals so that you can use the watch to tell time. There's an interesting sort of principle which comes out of this, which is that anytime you see something that is sufficiently complex, whose parts work together to perform a common function, you should infer that this thing has been designed, that there is a designer at work. Okay. Paley considers some possible sort of objections or criticisms or qualifications or limitations to this inference. For example, he says, well, you might think that, well, the reason why we think that watches are designed is because, well, maybe you've never visited a watch factory yourself, but you have independent knowledge of what people use watches to do because, you know, you've worn a watch and you look at it and you use it to tell time, or you've seen other people do that anyway. And maybe you just know because people have told you that there are watch factories out there. Okay, he says, but that's not necessary to the case. So even if, and this is really interesting, even if you saw a piece of technology that whose function you weren't quite sure of, you could still infer that it had been designed. So if you found something that looked like a tool on the beach that was complex, that had a bunch of different parts that worked together to perform some common function, where if any one of those parts broke or was moved out of alignment or something like that, the thing wouldn't work anymore, it would still be reasonable for you to infer that the thing had been designed. So even if you found a piece of ancient technology which you no longer understood, and you know the factories of which you could no longer visit or hear about, you would still infer that it had been designed. Okay, well, what is this? Maybe this is sort of cute or interesting, but you might think, well, why is he going on and on about watches? And the answer is that he thinks this can give you reason to believe that God exists, because the organs of animals and I suppose plants that we see on Earth are similar to watches in that respect. They have lots of different minute parts which work together to perform a common function. So look at your eye, for example. Your eye has all of these different parts, your retina and your lens, and the cells, which the nerve endings, which transmit information to your brain, and so on. Without, if any one of these parts sort of goes out of alignment or breaks, you know, your eyes either stop working completely, or they stop working for to a great extent. So, in that respect, eyes are like watches. They're complex. They have many parts that work together to perform a common function. And so, if eyes are like watches, and watches lead us to believe that they've been designed, that there's a designer at work, then eyes have been designed too. And if eyes have been designed, well, there must be a designer, and I don't know what you would call the designer who designs all of the eyes on Earth other than God. It's whatever created life on Earth. Okay, good. Paley's argument, Paley was writing in the, I believe, in the beginning of the 19th century. He was writing before the theory of evolution. So at the time, I think this is a very reasonable argument to make. I think also something that's interesting and important is that today we know Paley was mistaken. There are other, better explanations for how living creatures got to be the way they are and got to be as complex as they are. So Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection, sort of elaborated by modern biology and genetics after him, gives a better explanation of how creatures came to be the way they are today. We don't need to infer that there's a designer. So what can we learn from this? Well, one thing we can learn is that apparently good arguments like Paley's can fall apart if we haven't considered other possible explanations of how complexity might arise in a given object. So, you know, it could be that the mere fact that something is complex and seems to have a bunch of different parts which work together to perform a common function does not show that there's a designer at work. You need it further to show that there is no other explanation, or you need to have sort of looked hard enough for another explanation. And if you haven't looked hard enough, as Paley, alas, didn't, your design arguments will fall apart. So where does that leave us with Shi's rule? Well, Shi's rule says that if something is sufficiently weird that, or that is to say, if it's hard to explain in any other terms, there must be somebody at work. Well, okay, that maybe that still holds up after we consider Paley's example. The only problem with Paley is that he just didn't look hard enough for an alternative explanation. He didn't look hard enough, for example, for an evolutionary explanation of the biological facts that he had in front of him, that he wanted to explain in theological terms. I want to raise one other possibility, though, which I think is interesting. We might say that Paley was right to look at the watch and to infer that it has a design, that when you look at something like a watch, it really is appropriate to describe it in terms of the different functions that its parts perform. The same way that it's still, even if you don't think that God created each of the species on Earth individually, it's still reasonable for us to describe human hearts as having a function, or human eyes as having a function. Okay, so it's possible to use sort of design language even if there is no designer. We can still describe certain objects or systems of things as having different parts that work together to perform some function, as having in that sense a design, even if there is no designer. So human societies can be like that. So there might not be any master plan to, let's say, a small-scale society or even a family. But it could be that even without the master plan, the individual people in that society have functions that they perform. They do things that keep them around. Okay. Similarly, we could say the same thing about organs like eyes. Well, even if they weren't designed, they still do things which explain their continued existence and reproduction. And if they do things that explain their continued existence and reproduction, why does your heart stick around? Well, because it pumps blood. Why do people continue to have eyes? Well, because they aid in vision and in survival in a certain sort of way. So maybe one thing we can learn from Paley is that there can be design, there can be purpose or function in nature, even without a designer. What does that mean for Shi's rule? Well, I'll let you figure that one out. On that note,